Yes. Okay. Since the collapse of Western centrism in the last decade, one thing is now very clear. The future is nationalist. The excesses of globalism and universalist thinking have deeply fractured the West and has led to an upsurge of popularity for the concept of national sovereignty, identity, and others that would dominate the 20s and 30s. But still, tectonic shifts have made the ground under our feet sway, and there is no going back to the self-satisfied days of Western dominance. The very phrase, the West, is now undermined and made suspect, militarily, morally, philosophically, within its borders and without. Western civilization is a term of slander and abuse. This is a series of podcasts dedicated to the people that want to save the West, and who have the will and the ideas to get it done. So, what is the West? Who are the men and the ideas that will save it? And most crucially, what is to be saved? The promise of the West has always been a combination of sovereignty, pluralism, justice, and identity. In that vein, this series reacts against and rejects attempts to reformulate the centrist and globalist project, as well as the nihilism of denying the need for a civilization. From this vantage point, we ask, what is the role of identity and tradition? What are the limits to openness and pluralism in the world we are now shaping? And what replaces conservatism and liberalism within the scope of nationalism in the digital age? We strike at these concepts with a hammer and we'll listen to what rings true. We invite you to follow us on a journey to discover this, our future. Will you be among the men who have saved the West?
Well, on that programmatic note, we begin this episode of the Manifesto podcast. I think in terms of manifestos, this is probably the closest to a manifesto reading that we've done so far. And the session that we're going to have here is with none other than our esteemed guests, Alexander Bard, Benedict Beckeld, who've both been on here before, but also Ralph Schöllhammer. Is that the correct way of saying it?
Flawless. Yes, you pronounced it flawlessly.
So basically, coming back to Carl's description here, that is the men who saved the West. We aim for a conversation with the three of you, together with me and Carl, on basically the topics of what is the West, who are the men, and finally, what is to be saved. But first, could you please introduce yourself to who you are, what your work entails, so as to understand why you are the people, the men indeed, with which me and Carl would want to probe a conversation like this with?
The thing was that Benedict and I have been talking for a long time about how we could take his book on oikophobia, my work recently, process an event further into further conversations. And we're both friends of Johan and Carl. We all have connections to Scandinavia, all four of us. And then I just saw Ralph Schöllhammer on TV. I think it was a Polish TV station. And I just realized this guy is the star. This guy is the star. I was totally man-crushed by Ralph Schöllhammer. And we started talking to each other and realized we had tons of stuff in common. I went to Vienna to see him. And it was actually Ralph and me in Vienna, going about the whole thing, getting to know each other, that discovered that we tons of fun to start a podcast with the other three of you and just call it The Men Who Saved the West and then see where that would go. And here's why it's a great name. A great name always is ironic, but also has depth. So it's like deeply serious and ironic at the same time. So obviously we're not the men who saved the West or whatever, but the question right now, what is the West, is really a thrilling, nice question to ask. It doesn't have to be a finished answer. So what I want to throw into the conversation here, from my point of view, is that how the man who saved the West is basically what is the West, and then try to define it in tonight's conversation and see what we can agree on. And I want to throw into this sort of standardized versions of that is Josephine Quinn's new amazing book. This Oxford professor has written a fantastic book called How the World Made the West, which is the opposite of how I usually frame it. I mean, how was the concept of the West invented? Where did it come from? And she does exactly what you should do when you try to define something. She starts from a negation. She doesn't ask Westerners, what is the West? She asks people from the East, what is the West? And if you ask Chinese or Japanese or Indian people, what is the West? They'll say, oh, it's anything north or west of the Hindu Kush. So it includes Persia, it includes Russia, Eastern, Central, Western Europe, it includes the Mediterranean, and it includes both the Islamic and the Christian and the Jewish worlds in one. So all those words are included in the concept of the West if you ask a nation. And I think historically that makes tons of sense. But we also have the European Enlightenment. We all think we're huge fans of it, defenders of, and think it has some intrinsic value. So there's also a smaller concept of the West, which I would say starts with the European Enlightenment, which is something that intellectuals from British, French, and German background agreed on some 300 or 400 years ago. So I want to throw that into the mix series right away, that why I love having this conversation with you guys, and why I think the name, The Man Who Saved the West, is fantastic. It's ironic, but it's also deep.
Ironic, but also deep. Thank you, Alex. Benedict, you want to go next?
Yes. So as Alexander mentioned, I have the book on oikophobia, which I guess is how we actually first came into contact with each other, Alexander, you and I, and then through Alexander also with you, Juan and Carl. But anyway, yeah, so briefly, I'm a philosopher well, I actually work in several different areas, mostly in the last few years, anyway, political philosophy and the philosophy of history has been, but I also work in aesthetics, for example, which is what I'm working on right now. And but this all ties, I think, probably a common denominator of a lot of what I do is, in fact, the West. So this is an appropriate podcast for that reason as well, because of certain salient features that are common to the West, and that therefore make an expression in my work as well. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I think you said, as you mentioned, we have all ties to Scandinavia. I'm from Sweden originally, in the United States now, and but educated mostly in Germany, actually, in Heidelberg. So very Western, I think, in that sense. And one point that Alexander brought up, which I think is also a salutary point, is to see exactly how people outside of the West react to the West. I lived for a while. I went through a teaching stint in the Kalahari Desert, for example, quite a long time ago. And they themselves, you hear a lot of people here say that the West is a construct of a bunch of nationalists and Western supremacists and so on. And in fact, if you speak to people in the middle of the Kalahari Desert, they also have a very clear notion of the West, that the West is a separate thing. And so it's not obviously the case that this is just some construct that certain segments of the West came up with. The existence of the West, of course, one can argue about definitions, but the existence of such a thing as the West is fully recognized in the non-West as well.
Thank you, Benedict. Ralph, finally.
Yeah, great to be here. I have to say, Alexander, you are truly matchmaker for intellectual and philosophical minds, or at least I hope that this is turned out like this. So I'm very honored. I'm very happy to be here. I love Benedict's book on oikophobia. I think this is such an important term, particularly in the Western world. What drove me to my research interest, I wrote my dissertation at the University of Kentucky on the interplay of political psychology and political culture. And a lot of what I dealt with in there was also this question, okay, what is going on particularly in the West? That kind of a civilization that once was so dominant also seems now to be the one that is very strongly, embedded in the sense of either guilt or self-hate and where this came from. I worked a little bit with Alexander's work on, not our Alexander, somebody else, some other Alexander, who wrote on cultural trauma. I think there's a lot of that. I believe that the Western world, particularly with World War I and World War II, has been living through cultural trauma that I see a little bit at the root of oikophobia, although you can sense it early on. I think you can sense it a little bit already in the 19th century, where there's a certain unease when the idea of the Aryan race comes up, even before the Nazis, right? Where there's the idea that we Europeans are not genuinely Europeans, that we have our roots somewhere else, that there's something else that we should take, we should take our clues from. So there are some things that are very specific for the West. And on a more uplifting note, I believe also that what is mostly threatened by this oikophobia that Benedict has so eloquently described is we are at the danger of losing our sense of humor. And this is also something that I find quite crucial. You see this, by the way, politically on the left and on the right. And this is why I think that what we are pursuing with the idea of national liberalism is this sense of, yes, there should be something in which you are grounded, that you believe in, that makes you feel at home, that makes you feel that you belong. But it should not be a foam at your mouth kind of thing, right? It should something, if you're truly secure in who you are, you can take a joke. And I think what we can see more and more is a certain insecurity, both on the political left and the political right, which is why both of them can no longer take a joke. I'm slightly exaggerating, but only slightly, because I recently see that even the Babylon Bee, I'm sure that most of our viewers and listeners are familiar with, they really do funny stuff. But apparently now even the political right says, why are you so mean to us? And originally was only the left who kind of was, how dare you to make a joke? And I think this is a dangerous thing. If you are truly confident in your belief, in your convictions, in your identity, these things don't trouble you. And I'm working currently on this one paper where I'm glad when I once have it in a shape that I can submit it to you guys to read. And I would like to hear your opinion on this, that I have the theory that some of the best rulers have been the rulers who were capable of taking a joke. That's a kind of working title. But if you look at it, right, the best Roman emperors were ones that were very hands-off when it came to what people could say. Now, Frederick the Great, usually the Prussians are known as, the Iron Kingdom and everything was with an iron fist. But actually, when it comes to mocking, let's say, the ruling class, mocking those in power, they were fairly tolerant. They had their limits, don't get me wrong. But there was a certain sense that the kingdom is not going to fall, just somebody cracks a joke. And where do you not see these kinds of things? There is the Ayatollah Khomeini's famous saying, there are no jokes in Islam. So the Khomeini was pretty straightforward about this. And nobody ever said that Stalin and Hitler were particularly funny. We all know Milan Kundera's story about the joke, right? That's exactly about this. Some guy tells a joke and he finds himself in a working camp. So I think there's a parallel. And what I hope that we can do when people ask us, how will you guys save the West? I think one of the things that we hopefully will accomplish is we are cheerful about it, right? That we say it's a great civilization, there are great ideas, it's not perfect, but it's worth saving and it's a good fight to fight. There's no need, there's righteous anger has its role to play, but overall we're not going to be sensitive about it. Like we know that there are mistakes, we know it's not perfect, but it's definitely worth saving. And I think this is what we're trying to do.
I just want to add something there. We have the term extreme right Marxism. I know Joe and I totally subscribe to it. I don't know if you guys are up for it because I'm a Marxist, but I'm from the extreme right. It's the only position where you can be Marxist these days, which again, it's funny, right? So Simon Critchley is another extreme right Marxist. He's a hardcore Nietzschean these days, but he's also a professor at New School in New York, which is like the most infected woke place you could think of on the planet. I'm sure Benedict lives in New York would agree. So he's a professor at New School, probably gets paid to stay. That's why he's still there. Otherwise, he couldn't stand it. But Simon Critchley is one of those underrated philosophers today who's really smart. He's written a beautiful little book called Humor. And it specifically says, on the subtitle, it says that the least funny book you'll ever read, which is in itself, of course, is very funny. But it explicitly says humor is a form of intelligence. And people who don't have a sense of humor are stupid. And stupid people are dangerous. So the number one thing, intelligence being the most common word used in language today in any culture in the world because you're obsessed with AI right now, and intelligence not being defined by anybody. We've been really sloppy. We've thrown this word intelligence into the center of everything. We talk about intelligence all the time as if we knew what intelligence is. And actually, all we can say is that there are intelligences at best. There are a lot of different pluralistic versions of what intelligence could possibly be. We're working with that as philosophers right now, working with emotional intelligence at the moment, which is not machines are up to. But I think what Raoul said is just absolutely profound. Just like the word oikophobia is going to be part of this conversation, I said humor is a part of this conversation. There's something fundamentally wrong with a person who can't crack or understand a joke. And they're terribly dangerous. And I just gave you a name for that right now, Xi Jinping. You cannot joke about Xi Jinping in China at all. So it's like Muhammad who hated jokes too. Hitler hated jokes too. These guys are the ones we call boy pharaohs in our work. Boy pharaohs historically are these little 11-year-old boys who have way too much power and they can't stand a joke and they're incredibly dangerous. And we're not. We're funny.
I agree with Alexander. This is a good point, Ralph. And in a way, you already given the preamble to our final question, that is, what is to be saved? And perhaps humor is one of those aspects. But let's kick this off with the foundational definitions here. What is the West?
So what's happened is that Ferdinand Brodel did something amazing in the 1960s. It completely changed the way we write history. It's a total paradigm shift in meta-history, the way you write history. So the history of history writing was completely, radically changed. Ferdinand Brodel threw out all the kings and the battlefields and the dates and all that and said, no, history is about la longue durée in French. It's about long periods of time, changes over time, like technological innovation. What kind of effect does it have on society? What does it mean that we become agriculture rather than pastoral, rather than nomadic? He got interested in those things. So Ferdinand Brodel opened the door. Then pop philosophy finally caught up some 30 years later, usually with the help of Americans. Jarred Diamonds, Guns, Germs, and Steel is a perfect example of a classic book now, which does pop history based on Brodel's revolution. Then there are 3 books, and 2 of them you all know by now. There was Yuval Harari's Sapiens, which it's great that these books sell millions of copies because they change the world. People look at themselves by looking at history differently. So that rewrote history in a Brodelian sense, in proportion of that is Yuval Harari's book. And then it was Peter Frankopan's, another one of these Scandinavian Anglo-Saxons, Peter Frankopan's book on the Silk Road, which is just the Silk Road, just an amazing, amazing book. It's so thoroughly done. It completely rewrites history as a history of trade and of trade routes and of cultural connections and exchanges and everything. And it's this whole idea that we lived in isolated civilizations in Samuel Huntington kind of worldview completely fell apart because of Frankopan's work. Now, Josephine Quinn has done the same thing. She's a professor at Oxford, and she's written a book with a very, very funny but interesting title, How the World Made the West. So what she's actually addressing is the West. And she agrees with me that I would arrive at the concept of the West. My suggestion is to go with Josephine Quinn, which is say anything north of West, the Hindu Kush is the West. But that includes the Middle East, or rather it is the Middle East with Europe attached in the last 500 years. But I just want to throw that out there that I think it's a good conception of the West because that entire part of the planet has been in constant intercommunication with each other constantly and trading with each other and exchange, ideas and people, we sold slaves to each other all around that area. But if you look at the Middle East and Europe and the Mediterranean as the West, we undeniably had connections everywhere. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Phoenicians, they're all interconnected. So I would just propose that Josephine Quinn's version of the West could be a starting point.
I like that. I would add on one thing in more contemporary issues is if you look at human history or kind of modern human history, most of it was the history of empires, right? This for the most of the time, this has been the way in which politics was done, in which politics were organized. I think the idea that you can have different political entities, different political communities, where one is significantly more powerful than the other, yet they live in peace and on an almost equal footing. The idea of a family of nations, if you want, I think that is a profoundly Western idea. That you can have Switzerland next to Germany, and even though the Germans could take it over or they could divide it up between Germany and France, they don't do it because there's an idea of kind of almost a moral obligation to respect the unique identity of the Swiss, of another people. I'm not saying, to be very clear, I'm not saying that there were not phases within Western history where somebody tried to overthrow this. I mean, I guess Hitler comes to mind. But even there, if one takes a closer look, even that is trickier, right? So even the Germans, in their idea of the Nazi Empire, were kind of, so it will be like a traditional empire towards the east, but when they thought about what plans they had for the West, right, the idea was never to entirely annex France, for example. If you look at the way they treated prisoners of war, right, they were significantly milder to British or French prisoners of wars than they were, for example, to the Slavic, to the Russian, the Soviet, Ukrainian prisoners of wars. So I think that's also, it shows that even within the West, and that is also particularly Western, there are contradictions. So the West has been at war with itself very often, but I think this idea of having separate political entities that are not imperial in structure, existing next to each other, I think that is part of European history, and it goes back partially also to the city-state concept of the Greeks. But again, the Romans are then once again a little bit of a separate entity, but I think that is also something that is very Western in nature, and that then Europe tried to implement in the rest of the world, and I think the rest of the world is still struggling with this in many ways.
I just want to pass it on to Benedict because I totally agree, and a Chinese or an Indian intellectual would also agree. The format of the empire was invented in the West. It was invented by the Persians in the Bronze Age in response to Babylonians and Assyrians to invent something more civilized. Cyrus the Great conquering Babylon, 539 before Christ, shocking the Babylonians by not killing them and boiling their children in oil, but rather assimilating them into the Persian Empire, where they could all then have a court religion or a court language that run the entire empire with an infrastructure, and then have different nationalities. And this is what I want to pass on to Benedict, who's Jewish. Cyrus the Great loved the Hebrews that he found in Babylon, sent them back to build the second temple. And here's Hegel's point. When Hegel formalizes the concept of the nation state, another European innovation, 19th century, he basically just says the Jews did it already. Because what Jews obviously did, or the Hebrews did, and why the Persians loved them, was that they were the perfect nation within the empire because they actually had a language and an alphabet and a religion that they all shared together. I think the first nationality on the planet were the Jews. I'll see if Benedict agrees with that or disagrees or not, but could be a good starting point.
Yeah, so I like everything that's been said so far. Whether the Jews, probably it's The reason I hesitate a little bit to completely endorse that, although I think there's a lot of truth in what you say, is that, and this was another point more generally that I wanted to bring into the conversation at this point, which is that I take a slightly less exclusive view, if you will, to this type of question, by which I mean that I think the sort of the definite article in the West sometimes can tend to lead astray a little bit because it often makes us a little too fixated on a particular definition. I tend to take a more sort of Humean bundle theory view, or like a Wittgensteinian family resemblance kind of view to these sorts of things, that there are certain characteristics that we see and that we sort of see expressed in various, to various degrees in various places. But that such a view makes it a little more difficult to delineate precisely, either geographically or philosophically or ideologically, what precisely the West is. You know, you hear people have this sort of conversation as such as, for example, is South America part of the West? And I find the question itself to be, I find the premise of the question to be erroneous, because it's not, the question isn't whether South America is part of the West or not. The question rather is how many of the Western family resemblances that we recognize in the world can be found in the West. So obviously it is Western to some extent. The question is how much. And so that's the one sort of the additional consideration, I guess, that I would want to introduce into this question. But having said that, obviously, when it comes to those particular family resemblances, there are, of course, certain things that one can identify that are distinctly Western, and that are found to at least a much lesser extent outside of the geographical West. I do think that, when you, Alexander, bring up the Jewish nation, that is certainly one aspect of the West. And yes, in that sense, I do think, if we want to speak from a purely chronological point of view, the Jews probably were the first. But then, of course, you have additional characteristics coming in as well in Greece. And really, it's maybe a bit hackneyed to say, but those really are the two pillars, I think, that started the whole thing. And then you mentioned before, for example, the three Abrahamic religions. I would say that, again, even though one can recognize a certain family, one recognizes certain Wittgensteinian family resemblances across the three religions. Nevertheless, I think those resemblances are much stronger and are expressed to a much greater degree in, for example, Judaism and Christianity, and not in Islam. So that if one has to draw a fault line somewhere, I would still draw it between with Islam on the one side and Judaism and Christianity on the other side, even though there are, of course, certain similarities. So at some point, if one wants to define what the West is, one has to acknowledge, first of all, that there are these cross-contaminations and these family resemblances, but that at some point they become strong enough on the one side and weak enough on the other side that one can still draw a line between those two sides.
So I think here, for our listeners, I think this is an interesting line of demarcation in a sense, because this touches on our sort of one of the main concepts we have here, and it's national liberalism versus national conservatism in a sense. Ralph and Alexander have both spoken on national liberalism, and this very idea of the Jewish, the Hebrew state as the sort of the covenantal Hebrew state as the model for the modern nation state is the basis for the national conservative movement. You have Yoram Hazori is very, very, in all his works, is very clear on this. And I'm wondering if this is also not very much an American idea in a sense. I know he's Israeli and Jewish, but it's very much found sort of fertile soil in the US and, of course, in Europe too. I won't deny it, but there is sort of a Cold War reductionist, in my mind at least, sense here, where the West is very much an extension of history, but only from one certain, I'd say, rationalist maybe path. And I'm wondering, my first sort of open question is there a European sense here of a different West than a sort of American would hear this question? Does that make sense, not only from a sort of post-Cold War point of view, but from like a civilizational point of view? My sort of sense is that I have a West that is my definition can be very much friendly to Alexander's sort of Mediterranean plus view of the West for sort of historical reasons, but still, I think I have a political religious bone in me that sort of vibes with Benedict's definition and sort of a line of demarcation between Islam and Christianity. But still, it has to be said that this is the major question, because the commingling of ideas and peoples has very much accelerated in the last 20, 30 years. And this is why we're having, I think, especially in Europe, this question is so radically relevant nowadays, just because we have in Sweden a population of 20% who aren't Swedish or who are from either the Middle East or somewhere else. And this poses the question, what are we? Are we something? Is there a people? Etc. etc. I would just like to draw this sort of line in the sand. We can return to it if nobody has a comment, but I think it's important just to say the line of demarcation between national liberalism and national conservatism. We can talk on this.
Can I get to the quick crack? Because I think Carl pointed at something really important. And I think Benedict is absolutely right. The idea that there are clear lines, either intellectually, geographically, I think that would be a fool's errand. We wouldn't find them. And I think it would be also almost non-Western, because the more one dives into Western history, the more it becomes clear that we were very capable of picking and choosing things from other civilizations that had no problem in doing this. Right? It was never kind of navel gazing. But I believe a good way to look at this is, and I think this also maybe helps us to kind of define national liberalism a little bit better. The history of Russia and the United Kingdom is very different in many ways. But I would argue that you take somebody like Tolstoy, right? Tolstoy's favorite author was Charles Dickens, which tells me that even though you had a very Russian author and a very British author, they were capable of understanding each other, right? They lived in different countries at similar time periods, and their societies were going through similar phases where they found different answers to. I would even say that there's a difference in the Russian Enlightenment, in the Anglo-Saxon Enlightenment, and the Continental Enlightenment. And I think even there you could make a split between the French and the German Enlightenment. Now, so there are all these differences, but they spoke a language and they could understand each other in a way. I think that the further you got away from what quote unquote is the West, the more difficult this would become. Like the conversations they had with each other would have become more difficult to have them with a Chinese intellectual, and they did exist at the time, right? The point is never to say that there were no other intellectuals, but I think the kind of the familiarity, as Benedict said, I think there was not so strong that they could have had this kind of dialogue. And I think it opens something open up for us, is that being part of the West is not necessarily a permanent state. I would make the maybe somewhat provocative argument, but I would argue that until the Russian Revolution of 1917, in many ways, right, Russia was on a path to become part of the European West. And I think kind of the Leninist, Stalinist path they took later on actually alienated, which is of course a Marxist term, which kind of alienated them from the path on which they were before. Now, of course, you could say, well, isn't Marxism, isn't socialism, isn't Bolshevism in its way also a Western idea? And that is true. But I think this is then kind of where you have an additional split up. So you can be part of the West and you can cease to be part of the West. And one of the things that I like about the conceptualization about national liberalism is that it says there is an identity, an emotional factor to it, but it has a certain openness. Meaning that you can join the West, but even if you're not born there, just like you can, which is easy, I guess, in the United States and in the Anglo-Saxon world, you can become an American without being born there. You're right. You can't be born in Sweden. You move to the US, you have a child, and your child says, actually, I think the founding fathers are more relevant to me, my identity, and my history than whoever was, King Carl XII in a few centuries back. And I think this is. It is an ambiguous concept, but it's not necessarily a weakness. It just comes with the territory, because just as individuals, we wear different hats at different times. And I think the same is very, very commonplace and happens also with cultures and civilizations.
I would add to that the Ottomans also walked in and out of this concept of the West. So that perfectly rhymes with that. I think what happened was that the printing press is a common denominator, because the printing press, invented by Germans, and then spread across Europe, as we know Europe now, was used to translate the Bible to the local dialects. So we only had Latin. We have to remember, we only had Latin before that as a common shared language. It was an imperial language of Europe, and the church was imperial, and that was it. Everything else, just the local dialects everywhere, didn't communicate too much with each other. Nothing really happened, and Europe was dirt poor. It was dirt poor until we get to the printing press. And then 40 years later, we discovered the Americas, and gold flushes in from the Incas into Spain, and suddenly the whole thing changes. But the printing press did the trick here. So the printing press is a common denominator for what we call Western culture in that sense, because then the Russians not only translated the Bible, or the English translated the Bible, but they actually started translating English and French and German text to Russian, and Russian novels were translated to Swedish and whatever. So we started inventing these national tongues around Europe, and they all shared literature with each other, and therefore they shared a lot of culture in common. And then they, in the 19th century, reinvented their own history by saying it started with the Greeks against the Ottomans. Why? Because the Ottomans did not have a printing press. It wasn't necessarily Islam. It was not a printing press. But because the Ottomans literally banned the printing press and meant it. The printing press was banned in France. Everybody ignored it. It's a bit like cannabis. Everybody smokes it anyway. So the French just ignored it. They smoked their cannabis. They used the printing press. They printed like mad. It led all the way up to the French Revolution, 1789. And then it led to the European exodus, which was the creation of the United States of America through Freemasonry. And that was the European dream come true. And then Europe could just export any dreamer over to America and take over the world from there as well, whereas Europe could just find its place on the map. This is the amazing history of Europe the last 300-400 years. The printing press is the common denominator. It's a technological innovation that the Europeans excelled at. The Ottomans were tied out. And this, I would say, I don't know if Benedict agrees with me. My problem with Islam, and it's a huge problem, my problem with Islam is the lack of a proper enlightenment in Islamic culture. It doesn't exist. Islam stayed feudal, just like Russian communism failed because Russia tried to go against Marx with Lenin and jumped over the whole development into a bourgeoisie that could choose a communism if they wanted to, called social democracy, in elections. No, that never happened in Russia. Russia thought, Lenin was obsessed with power, thought he could just take, the slaves, the serfs of the Russian countryside and threw them into communist paradise. Terrible mistake. This connect between going from feudal straight into paradise is what I think Islam and Russian communism share. And this is the problem we're confronted with today. It's called Putinism and it's called Islamism today. And they're major problems for the West we need to deal with. And I'd say, guys, if you didn't take part in the Enlightenment and if you didn't implement the Enlightenment, which is what Lenin refused to do, if you don't implement the Enlightenment, then you haven't even studied Marx. You can't even apply Marx onto it. And that, I think, is the problem. Putinism and Islamism being the two words for the two problems we're dealing with here.
Yeah, I would. This is what I love about a conversation like this. I listened to you people for 5 minutes, and I had already so much to say. So it's I think we're gonna have to meet again. But anyway, so Carl, maybe I'll go back to what you said first about the that European American divide and also national. Although maybe the distinction between national and liberal conservatism. Maybe we'll get to that. Not conservative. Conservative or liberal nationalism. I meant to say maybe that distinction we'll get to later. I would say briefly in that regard, in line with what I said before about taking a non-exclusive view and how these areas sort of bleed into each other. I think the national conservatives are much more liberal than they pretend. Hazoni's book, whose title I've forgotten, it's over there somewhere. I forgot because it was a genuinely. I'm not sure. I don't want to be mean-spirited, but the book was genuinely forgettable because it pretends to be so conservative, but it's actually very liberal. What he paints up there as his sort of national conservative wish list, it's a veritable liberal wish list. And I mean, what you said before, Ralph, about how one can be born somewhere else and still adapt and then still become adopt a new identity. This is what he calls national conservatism, because he talks about this exact thing as being one of the virtues of national conservatism, but it is in fact, one can just as easily say, and I think with even more justice, that it's actually an expression of liberalism. And so he just changes the words. But anyway, when it comes to the distinction between Europe and maybe we'll get into more of this as well, in America, I would say, don't want to generalize too much there, but I would say to a considerable degree, Europe, the difference in this regard is that Europe represents a more decayed form of the West. I don't think that America and Europe offer radically different versions of the West. I think just one is more decayed than the other. And one can see because America is becoming more and more like Europe in a number of respects. And so I think that we are also continuing on that path of decay where Europe has already gone. When it comes to what you said about Islam, Alexander, maybe that's one thing where I would take a slightly different view, which is you say what the problem with Islam is that it lacks an enlightenment. Of course, that's true. But I would say I would make the additional distinction that Islam was in greater need of an enlightenment in the first place than Christianity. Christianity, much of the violence and much of the many of the awful events that we associate historically with Christianity were, in fact, at least if you look at Christian philosophy to a considerable extent, not that there is such a thing as a Christian philosophy, there are many expressions of it, but by and large, was anti-Christian to a considerable extent. Whereas the bad behavior of Muslims throughout history is much more deeply connected to actual Islamic philosophy and Islamic history in the first place. And so when people say that, Christianity went through a reform and went through an enlightenment, and now we're just waiting for Islam to do the same thing, I think that glosses over the more fundamental differences that exist between those two religions. And which is also another reason, by the way, where we can draw a bit of a fault line when it comes to the West between the two religions, because they didn't have the same starting point. Christianity started out, at least from the point of view of the Enlightenment, in a much more enlightened manner, quote unquote enlightened manner, than something like Islam did.
I could just add to that the problem with Islam fundamentally, and I agree here, is that it doesn't have a separation of church and state. The brilliance of Christianity was the separation of church and state, at least was in the ideology.
And which goes back to Judaism.
Yeah, true. Yeah, but exactly. It goes back actually to Zoroastrianism and Persian philosophy, which really reinstated you must separate the priest from the chief, period, right? So the separation of church and state had been there all along for anybody who started thinking in the Bronze Age. It's terribly dangerous to have somebody who aspires to be both, the chief and the priest at the same time. Xi Jinping in China today, Putin, right? These tyrants they're all trying to be these things, both things at the same time, and therefore we get the tyrant. And we go down with this stupidity and we go down. That's how you actually really decay. But I think the problem with Islam was that Christianity didn't have it. So the Christian world was open to the fact, for example, capitalism could be invented, another Jewish innovation, by the way, then is 15th century. And capitalism, you add the printing press to that, start printing paper money. Of course, that made the whole European economy explode and Europe became the center of the planet because of it. And then developed America after that. So there's something to that. There's definitely theological differences that are very, very important here. Now, I wouldn't say, though, that it's impossible with the Islamic world today because Islam is also imitating. And the problem today is rather the opposite one, is that the Islamic secularization and the move towards hedonism is in full swing in the Middle East. Last time I was in Dubai, they took more drugs than anybody ever did in Ibiza. And Dubai is the new idea. It's like nobody wants to hear about Gaza. Everybody wants to hear about Dubai. And the irony is, of course, that if Hamas hadn't torn Gaza apart, it could have been a new Dubai today. Now, apparently, the Emirates are building a new Dubai anyway in Egypt to show the Gazans how it should have been done. They invested $22 billion buying property west of Alexandria in Egypt to build what Gaza should have been, which is another Dubai. So, okay, the Arabs have realized that with oil money thrown into their economy, they can build places like Dubai, and now they go hedonist. The problem is that means the most conservative Islamists around are the ones we're stuck with in Europe, not in America, not in the Middle East. We're stuck with millions of them in Europe. And that's exactly, we have the hardcore kernel today of Islamic fundamentalism, and we have to deal with it in Europe because the secularization has at least started. It could also, of course, go backwards, but it started. My friends in Iran said they're all laughing at the mullahs. It's only a matter of time before the mullahs fall. It's all about the exit of the mullahs to get out of the way because everybody hates their guts. Nobody wears their job in Tehran in the subway any longer. So something is going on in the Middle East. And I think it's not because of Islam. I think it's actually literally because the Enlightenment happened in the West. It is now being imported to the Arab world. And they're basically sidelining Islam. I said, forget about Islam. Out with the scholars. We don't care. Because that's the benefit of being the second to the game. So I'm not saying secularization couldn't happen in the Middle East. I think it's actually literally happening right now. But the chaos that's creating, and one thing, if you corner a fundamentalist, it's going to go more aggressive. I think we're going to see more Christian fundamentalism coming out of America. We certainly see a lot of new Jewish fundamentalism coming out of Israel. We're seeing definitely a lot of Islamic fundamentalism coming out of the Middle East. And what's happening is the fundamentalists are going desperate. And the more desperate they go, the more violent they get. That's the problem we have to deal with.
Sorry.
Please go ahead.
I would gently push back a little bit on what Alexander is saying. Although his scenario is very plausible, it is also possible that we run what I call the Berlin 1920s mistake, which is if you went to Berlin in the 1920s, you said, oh my God, and just Alexander would probably said the same thing. They take more drugs than have ever been taken, and you have all these burlesque shows and topless dancers, but Babylon Berlin, right? You said, oh my God, look what's happening. But what everybody overlooked in the 1920s in Berlin was what was happening in the rural areas, what was happening outside of Berlin, where you had a very, very different moving coming together. And I think Dubai is a little bit like Berlin in the Middle East. I don't think that the elites of Dubai are really representative of the broader the broader Arab population. Just to give you one example, they did a recent poll in Saudi Arabia. 90% of the people of Saudi Arabia would not allow a Jewish prime minister or an Israeli prime minister to land in Saudi Arabia to participate in an international summit. So these things are still there. I agree that probably Islamism is more a problem already in Europe than it is in the Middle East, but I don't think it's dead in the Middle East. I just think for them it's natural. Whereas probably in Europe, right, you have kind of the fervor of the converted. That probably is not to that extent present in the Middle East. And we saw, again, I push back here very, very carefully, but we saw a similar thing with the Arab Spring, right? The idea was you saw the pictures out of Alexandria, you saw the pictures in Cairo, and it was, oh my God, the Arab Spring, this is the moment when liberalization, when liberalism will finally enter the Middle East. And basically what you got the Muslim Brotherhood here, and you got the even more Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt until the military took over again. And if you look at the recent elections in Turkey, where it says, oh, look at Erdogan was defeated, this is a sign that the secularists are coming back in force. But if you take a close look at these secularists, they are secularists who actually talk quite a bit about Islam. Like they talk more about Islam than Ataturk did. So we might see a professionalization or maybe a taming of Islamism. But I'm not entirely sure if hedonism is at the moment really this kind of wave that I would also love it to be. Although on the other hand, isn't that what we're also critical of? Kind of that kind of hedonism is also part of the problem or a reason for Western decay. So I think that many in the Middle East will say, do we really want to go down the same route as the people in the West did?
Well, wait a second. Hedonism is part of the thing because you can't get out of a certain stuck mentality and go into another one unless you go through these nihilisms as a part of the nihilism. We can go into that later because it's just part of the way it has to be done. This is the thing. The Arab Spring is a success to people in the Middle East because they don't understand what we thought it was about politics, because it wasn't about politics. It was about culture. Girls drive cars in Saudi Arabia, etc. And we know from Europe that once these things get started, then there will be backlashes, but eventually things will go that way. There can be incredibly dangerous, bad things happening on the way. We could even have Armageddon in the next 10 years, easily. That's how vulnerable things are right now. But I would say, talking to people in the Middle East, they say for them, the Arab Spring was success because they can speak much more openly and freely, and they want to go bourgeois, and they want to go hedonist and all that. And I think they have to go through that and then have the dialectical reaction against that, like we're having here now in Europe and America. We realized that hedonism, the way it was presented in the 1960s, was a dead end. There's wide agreement about that. Actually, we all agreed that there can only be nationalisms from now on, because nationalism is like this idea that society has to function. It has to work, the sort of banal narcissism you see influencers doing on Facebook, where that's dead and over, even with the kids. So I agree on that.
I would just say briefly, part of that nationalism is also to make the point that you referred to Christian and Jewish fundamentalism earlier, Alexander, would be to also make that point that Christian and Jewish fundamentalism is still, even though I don't think anyone here identifies with either of those, they're still very different from Islamic fundamentalism. In the sense that they're simply not as noxious, and they are not as Christian fundamentalism slightly more than Jewish fundamentalism, but they are still not as imperialistic as Islamic fundamentalism, and not as deadly. And I think understanding that is part of nationalism, whether one is a conservative or more liberal nationalist. Understanding that our traditions and our roots, even though again I think in this group probably do not subscribe to any of them. That we still consider them better than the non-Western fundamentalism of Islam, which simply is written a whole article about all the problems with it, but it's quite a lot worse.
I wanted to broach on one aspect we have, I think, perhaps glossed over. Alexander touched on it partly in mention to Xi Jinping, but I think it's been useful this far in understanding the West with regards to how it's being negated or defined by people beyond the West or critiqued as now from groups within the West. And in a way, I think it connects to Ralph's point about how you, within the West, or at least from a liberal nationalist point of view, you can change your identity. You mentioned that you might not be that interested in the Swedish imperial monarch, Carolus Rex. But the point here is not just if you're interested in Carolus Rex, but Carolus Rex is still very much interested in you. And this, in a way, is also the point about Islam in Western countries, that the people coming here tend to be on two extremes. One being more liberal, wanting to escape Muslim countries, or the other one that are too radical even for those Islamist countries. This is very much a story about the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, coming from Egypt into Sweden. But I think the one point that we have, in a way, not addressed here is the other notions of empire. And in a way, you could say that Islam or Muslim Brotherhood idea of Ummah is something akin to a world-encompassing idea of empire, and therefore how it also influences or has claims with regards to Western countries. But also with regards to the Chinese concept of empire, that is Tianzi, or all under heaven. And traditionally, of course, Tianzi would refer to anything within the Han Chinese territory. But as this power expands, then the concept can also culturally and geopolitically be expanded to hypothetically include the rest of the world. And I think understanding, in a way, what the West is also in relation to, Ralph, you mentioned that the Western notion of empire is one where empires can actually coexist between each other, or peoples can coexist between each other. There's an idea of a power balance. Whereas in the Tianzi or the Chinese, while benevolent, it is still very much one power base that then brokers peace between others. Looks similar to the Persian notion or the Zoroastrian notion of power broker, but very different when you look into how it's actually being, how it's historically has functioned. Would you care to speak to this point before we move on?
I can just add that America is a functioning empire because America attracts everybody from all over the world to move to America. You got 5 or 6 million Indians who now live in America. They make on average per family 3 times more than the average American family. They make like $1.6 million a year, whatever it is. I don't know, but it's just enormous amounts of money. They're everywhere in the Bay Area. They're everywhere at the tech companies. They come to America to succeed, and they take whatever Hinduism they like with them. And the same thing for Chinese. Chinese people are leaving China. They're leaving for Taiwan. They're getting out of Hong Kong. They move to Singapore. Then they move on to Australia, to Canada, to the United States. Why? Because those are the empires. Empires are welcoming of people who want to move in and be part of the culture and then succeed. So America cannot be nationalist. Whenever America waves the flag, we always point out that it's a Swede. I don't have to wave the flag all the time and sing the national anthem every morning, because you only do that when your national identity is weak. Because why? America is an empire. America is a successful empire. It's the most successful empire ever. America inherited from the Persians and the Romans the whole idea of Western empire, and they're really good at it. What's the problem with Europe is, and this is where Europe has to be stay with nationalism, is nationalism is the only alternative. The only way Europe can approach the future right now, when all the best guys go to America and we get sort of the rest in Europe, called refugees. Hello. It takes generation for refugees to get assimilated. For anybody who just wants to work hard, it takes 14 days and they're in. You become a cab driver in New York, you send your kids to Stanford. That's still the American story. Won't happen in Europe. Whatever you. So the response is very natural. The first thing is that Europeans need to identify who they are, which is nationalism. So they need to first go NatCon, which is national conservatism. I find this absolutely natural. I work with the Sweden Democrats, but I'm not a Sweden Democrat. Just to give an example, I'm a liberal. But I find it absolutely natural that the massive reaction in Europe right now, the healthy reaction, is to try to find some kind of identity. Some of those guys go for Christianity, just be trying on to it. Some of the guys, like, for example, Macron in France, has understood that defending the French Enlightenment against Islam is his thing, right? So, okay, you could pick either one of the two. You can either take the Enlightenment or Christianity. You need to pick one of them and build your sort of European local nationalism on that, and then go conservative, like whatever you find, defend it, especially because Islam is the negation to what you're doing. Then I want to talk about later what Rolf and I have in mind, which is like if we understood that nationalism is fundamental for people to feel secure, and borders must work, right? If you understood that for Europe, then we can start discussing what would it take just to challenge people a bit to be a bit more liberal and open-minded about things, and having a smaller government and having more money in their own pocket to making their own decisions. Because for me, liberal nationalism is the same thing as national conservatism, just with much smaller governments and much more of your own money in your own pocket. And you pretty much solved it, and you got liberal nationalism right there.
Ben, Ralph, do you want to speak to the previous point, or should we move on to what Alexander just laid out?
Just one quick point, because I very much like what you said, both about the Chinese and a few others. And that's a phenomenon we can discuss whether this was always around in Western civilization or Western thinking, or if this is something that came up particularly after World War II, because I'm not sure myself. But I think we have a different attitude towards change and towards history. And what I mean by this is, at least in the modern Western mind, very often change is seen as something positive. Right? We see this the same with young people. Actually, revolution is seen as something desirable. You see this particularly at university campuses. Now, I would argue there's a tradition in the West that didn't see it this way, like Thomas Hobbes comes to mind, like who was not a fan of revolutions. So I think there is both sides are here. And the other thing is, and it's, I think, partially grounded in the fact that the Chinese, the Han, one way or another, China has been around continuously for a long time. But Rome, for example, is no longer around, right? The Greek city-states are no longer around. So there is this kind of far reach back into history is something that maybe we nationalists occasionally like to do, but it's not as ever present potentially as it is in other areas. And one area where I believe we see this, I'm a little generalizing here, but I think we'll get my point. I find this always interesting because we mentioned the Middle East, and I think it applies there as well, which is some people, a significant number at least, they really hold grievances that go back to 1948. And even if you look at the media, this is presented as something that is understandable, right? This idea, yes, there has something happened in 1948, and there would be a dispute about this land, and so on and so on and so on. But that would literally be the same as if Germany and France would still be quibbling over the Alsace-Lorraine, or if the Germans would say to the Poles, we want Pomerania back, or to the Russians, we want Kaliningrad back, or the Austrians saying to the Italians, we want Bolzano back. And these conversations, I mean, there are some individuals who talk like this, but this is not a broad-based movement of saying, let's redraw the borders in Europe, because there's an attitude that says borders change, countries change, you lose a war, you kind of have to live with its consequences. This is just how it is. So this kind of is historical, long-lasting historical grievances that probably existed before 1945, but I think in the post-1945 West, that is not something that's around. I'll give you one final example, because I very much like that Benedict also talked about Latin America. So there is also, I've talked to people in Mexico who still, maybe they mean it jokingly, but with this idea that, well, New Mexico and California kind of technically should be part of Mexico, is at least something, a thought that they entertain. But this is something that even the concept of territorial disputes is something we no longer have. And as Alexander mentioned, I'm sure that Benedict can speak to even more informed than I do, is that it's not really about the territory. It's about the emotional connection you feel with the territory. The same with the Chinese, right? The Chinese don't need Taiwan to survive. They don't need Hong Kong to survive. It's an emotional thing, right? You say, we are somebody now, so we want to, we want to revise all these unequal treaties that were forced upon them in the past. But that's more a pride, a passion thing, and not so much, oh my God, we need to have this area, otherwise, they control our water supply, they control our food supply. I mean, there are some strategic elements, but that's not the main driving force. And kind of last point on this, there is this problem. There are parts of the world that really speak an entirely different historical, moral language than we do. And I think this is why very often misunderstandings occur. Last point on this, I think the same is true for Russia. I'm not, just to be very clear, I'm not in Putin's camp. I have condemned the invasion of Ukraine from day one, but it is absolutely clear that in the mind of people like Putin, and I think those who support him, there is this idea that Ukraine is kind of the thing, the bridge to Europe, and it is something that is supposed to be part of Russia, either very closely in a sphere of influence or ideally as a part of Russia itself. And that is not driven by, I find this ridiculous, by fear of NATO or by fear of European EU expansion. Like the idea that anybody is afraid that the European Union will send troops anywhere is, frankly said, ridiculous. But it's that the passion, the emotion they connect to this. For them, it is crucial that it's part of Russia because they feel so strongly about it. And this is something we no longer, which I think is potentially a good thing, this is something we no longer do to that extent in the West. We no longer have these disputes.
No, the thing was this.
Can I have a slight pushback and a slight modification? Yeah. I think, I mean, I'm not sure that the Roman Empire is gone, in the sense of, we first had the Roman Empire, then we had the Holy Roman Empire, and now we have the federal EU project, and obviously that's not the same thing. But with NATO, with American Empire overlap, we have had a freezing of borders at least since 45 in the western part of Europe, and then with expansion on the eastern part of Europe. And that has been the sort of deal to include everyone in sort of imperial solutions so we can freeze borders and things. The problem is happening, as we stated in the intro, when this sort of decrease of American power relatively to all other countries is happening, and people are getting very nervous all over the place that, that this deal is going to change. And I'm not saying, the US is going to implode tomorrow, whatever. But I mean, it is a fact. I mean, that the facts on the ground can change very fast. 2 years ago, we hadn't seen Yugoslavia, I think, was the only case where this sort of thing had happened in our memory, inside of quote unquote European borders, right? But now we have Ukraine, and obviously that's not the same sort of Europeanness as Yugoslavia. But I mean, I think this is what's shocking to the system, and I think that's sort of shocking to our conception of the West as this sort of fixture, as this sort of deal that we and our parents lived in, and we can sort of feel secure in the fact that this will always happen. This will always be like it is today, and hence I think even though people in Hungary aren't actually trying to renegotiate the Treaty of Trianon from 1919, it's a talking point because it's their sort of way of expressing national populism, national conservatism in a sense. I mean, it seems always perverse for, I think, everyone who's not Hungarian. But I mean, it's still a fact that there are a lot of Hungarians in Romania, et cetera, right? So, I mean, this is the problem, that we're in this sort of gray area where sort of imperial power fades, and as much as I dislike the sort of Roman analogies, it must have felt like, it's sort of the feeling, where the central power when Rome goes, and you don't know, like, is the guy in charge of the armies of the Rhine in Gaul, is he going to proclaim himself emperor? What's happening? I think we're in a sort of, we've been in for 10 years, this sort of space and frame of mind, and this with, again, the Roman analogies are close, the migration of peoples. You have a whole sort of rediscovery of, okay, this is a new sort of state of mind. Where are we? Are we still Sweden? Are we still Europe? How do we find ourselves in relation to this? So I'd say yes, we have still sort of Roman Empire, the imperial solution. We still have the civis Romanus citizenship contention in European, and I think so. This is sort of the beauty, but also the problem, because what is the alternative if this goes? And for me personally, I have a feeling. I mean, as a slight, I think I'm the pessimist of the group here, but I think the problem with national liberalism is it's really good sell, but it's sort of things have to keep on going like they have been. You can't endure too many shocks to the system and still hope that people are liberal, because they won't be. And we will have tribal rule and anarchy instead. I think that's my contention.
There's a genius to this. The genius lies in, what if the American empire pulled out of Europe? It would be disaster. Because our whole model we're talking about here is that the Americans are the Persians or Romans, and the Europeans are the Hebrews. They're like the perfect little nation within the American empire, which in case of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia would mean that Russia would get Novorussia. They would get that train that goes all the way down to Crimea, and they can have their holidays on the Black Sea, on conquered territory or whatever. And Ukraine gets smaller. It shrinks to about 80% the size of what currently it was, but it becomes a member of NATO and the EU, and therefore Ukraine becomes part of the American empire anyway. Now, if America pulled out of Europe, the entire dynamic of Europe would implode. And here's the problem. What Putin played into was, of course, that everybody made a mistake. The official story was that the borders set after 1945 were fixed forever. Nobody should ever move a border. Even if people move, nobody can move a border. And then, of course, Kosovo happened. Kosovo of all places. I mean, this was something you could completely ignore. If you just say, it's just part of Serbia, some funny Arabs, Albanians, and of course, what happened was that Kosovo was conquered by the Americans by bombing Serbia, another Western nation, and the American empire showed that, no, we're going to change the borders, we're going to declare Kosovo independent, and then we filled Europe with crime syndicates coming out of Kosovo and a few fashion models. That's what happened. And of course, then Putin just sat and said, okay, whenever I have a problem, I could just roll the second biggest army in the world into territorial, and regain power by being popular in Russia. And of course, he has done it wonderfully. He done what Putin is really clever in this, as he knows exactly how to survive. He's a mobster running a Sicilian mafia. That's what Russia is today. And he works South Ossetia, nobody cared. Abkhazia extended the Russian Black Sea coast, extended the Russian Riviera. They got it. They got to throw tons of money in there as soon as they have them and build skyscrapers along the coast or whatever they're going to do. The Russians have their Riviera now. They have Crimea, and they have Sochi, and they have Abkhazia, all conquered territory. It used to be Muslim, by the way. If you go back 200 years, it's all going to be the Russian Riviera. And we're going to have to accept it, and the Russians have to accept Ukraine becomes part of NATO. But this entire model we're looking at, the eventual peace negotiation between Ukraine and Russia, is completely dependent on the American empire still looking at Europe as part of his empire. Because if the Americans pull out, Germans and French go to war again. And that's the problem with nationalism. Nationalism only works within an imperial structure. That's my whole point. The Hebrews inside the Persian Empire and eventually inside the Roman Empire are the perfect nation state. That's why I love Israel today. It's the perfect nation state, but it should be within an imperial context. That's why it works.
Unless it's Austria-Hungary, then it's sort of, sorry, Ralph.
What? No, go on. Go on.
No, but the nations within an empire and a state. I mean,
you mean when an empire looked good? When an empire looked good was in 1910. Everything has gone downwards after 1910. Okay. Right before Titanic, the world looked great.
Okay. Just to say, as a quick remark, I since Carl deliberately provoked me, I will make the historical counterfactual and say, if World War I would not have happened, then the Austria-Hungarian Slavic, it would be like the United Kingdom, the Welsh, the Scots, and the English. I think it is still possible. You can have, or take the Swiss, right, with the Italian, French, and German-speaking part. You can have different ethnicities and different languages and a shared common identity, which again is for me at least one of the core of the concept of national liberalism. I can be an Austrian-Hungarian patriot. I can be an American patriot. I slightly disagree with Alexander on the point that American identity is weak, and that is why they have the Pledge of Allegiance. And so I think it's the opposite. It's something that particularly newcomers, some at least, really enjoy, because they don't say, oh, you came from Sweden, you sit in the corner while we, sixth generation coming from the Mayflower Americans say the Pledge of Allegiance. They say, oh, I know you just came over yesterday. Let's say our Pledge of Allegiance. That's awesome. This is what the Continentals have. I also have my issues with Islam, but I have to admit we also do a really bad job in integrating Muslims. I think particularly young Muslims would be very receptive to the concept of nationalism. But the kind of, and this is, I hope that I pull Benedict in the conversation, but I think a society that suffers from oikophobia is not an attractive model for integration. It always, to mind comes always the famous Osama bin Laden line, right? When he said, when people see a strong horse and a weak horse, they naturally prefer the strong horse. And I think identities are not that dissimilar. So you have resurgent Islam on the one hand, we have a backbone, we are strong, we conquer the world. And then you have kind of the oikophobic West on the other side who says, we have done so many bad things and being European and Western and white is horrible and thank God you are not. Why would everybody want to integrate into this? I mean, this is not an attractive offering of a culture you want to integrate into, I believe at least.
I tell you what, in Sweden, Muslim men are fucking radical feminist women. It's already happening on a large scale. So you're right, and you're Freudian right.
Ralph, I also want to add, I have a mother from Friuli, and I remember vividly in the late 90s, before the EU craze sort of went around, that in every sort of establishment you went into, there was a picture on the wall of Franco Giuseppe, obviously is Franz Joseph in German, and there were a lot of Zs for Centraleuropa on the cars instead of anything else. And I think in that part of Italy, they fondly remember the Austrian Empire as the good old days.
Yeah.
And I think the Yugoslavs have, the same feeling for Tito. It's sort of perversely, but still true, right? And this is the world we live in. Johan, let's. I think you want to continue something. I feel a driving sense in you that you have something to.
I have a driving sense, but I also want to let Benedict comment on the Nietzschean philosophy via the philosopher Osama bin Laden.
Oh, right. Well, again, my problem is that listening to you people is a little too stimulating, because then now I don't want to go back and address every single point because there's so much to talk about. But a couple of things, yeah. So when we talk about the nationalism, so I mean, yeah, not to get too personal, but I myself am an example of the point that Ralph made there earlier. I was born in Sweden, then came to the United States in my early teens, and there's absolutely no question, and I know other immigrants to the United States, no matter where they came from, Asia, Africa, South America, or Europe, they all feel the same thing, that they basically felt more American within the first year or so than they felt whatever they were in their home countries. And so I do think it is a distinct form of nationalism, but I think it's still a type of national identity. And I don't think that everything that we do, the Pledge of Allegiance and all of these things, and the flag waving and all of this, it's not a Band-Aid or anything like that. It's really, I think it's very, very genuine. And when
can I just tell one small point?
Yeah.
That's imperial identity. I'm not saying imperial identity is weaker than national identity. Often it's stronger and it's easier to.
But then, so how? Okay, fine. But
America's
then, how do you?
imperial identity. It's an imperial flag.
Okay,
Yeah.
so okay,
It's not
so
nationalist. Yeah, that's the difference. No, America is strong in assimilating people precisely because it's imperial. The hard thing is stagnation and try to pull people in. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if we're maybe then just arguing about words rather than about the thing itself. So whether you would identify that as an imperial identity or a national identity, yeah, okay, that's a distinction one could make. But I think
look, this is just to give you your due here, Benedict.
Yeah.
It works as long as the imperial has force. Basically,
right.
Whatever exists when the force recedes, that would be the national pull. So we do have a problem if what we're talking about is a disintegration or the managed decline of imperial order by the US.
Yeah. Yeah, so as Ralph said, you prefer the strong horse and so on. Yes, that's certainly true. It does depend on strength to some extent. But I think the same thing goes to a considerable extent. The same thing can to a considerable extent be said in Europe as well, in more traditional national identities, because the spread of oikophobia in Europe has gone hand in hand. I'm not saying there's a direct that it's not a one factor relationship, but it does go hand in hand with the weakening of those countries as well. So I think that weakness that you can point to when you speak about imperial identity, I think to at least some extent the same weakness can be pointed out in more traditional national identities as well. Then there are a bunch of other points I'd love to address as well. Well, I mean, for example, that it's more about emotion than territory. For example, another point that was raised earlier is one to which I would also subscribe. I think, Ralph, you brought that up. The fact that, I mean, in the Middle East, for example, I think we should make the point that nationalism when it comes to the Middle East is not entirely, but still mainly a Western imposition. And it's not really. It's a Western invention, and most of the peoples of that area are much more tribal than nationalistic, really. And they didn't really care about the land of Israel or what we call today Israel until the emotional response was triggered by the fact that the Jews started resettling. I mean, Jews were always there, but that they came in new waves, and so territory nationalism there as a response to 1948, I think actually has very little to do with it.
Now I want to pivot to more the discussion of what we've been broaching with regards to the different ideologies or political currents or undercurrents. That is, if we now talked a lot about, I mean, not just solely, but a lot about the West, how to define it, delineate where it's heading, then the question in a way is, what kind of movements can marshal the men? Again, I'm relying here on Alexander's double-edged, ironic, but also sincere connotation in this term. That is, what are the political movements that can mobilize sufficient power, will, vitalism, use whatever pet peeve term you like here, to actually make a dent in the changes? Or is this simply inertia, deterministic forces, and thereby rendering our conversation meaningless? Or is there actually a will with regards to both defining what these political movements are, and then how they can be influenced in the next stage?
I'd say the hero right now is Elon Musk. He's an American hero. He's a South African immigrant to America who made it. And he's going to make it again. And he's what young, ambitious young men aspire to. So he's on the engineering side, which is fine. He's a chief. He's not a priest. And what I'm working with at the moment, for example, with Max Borders in America, is to see what could be sort of a priestly complementary role to the big tech barons. So America solved it because big tech is an entirely an American phenomenon. Besides Mistral in France, the whole AI train's gone off and the Americans are running it and the Europeans are completely made redundant. Europe is so slow to catch up with these things. And if there isn't a radical awakening in Europe, like we're just like the senior citizens in the retirement home of the world. Then Europe is, if there isn't an awakening in Europe, this is not going to end well. This is going to end with war and poverty, as it always does when things fall apart. Oikophobia, yeah, it's a massive problem in Europe, but it's like Benedict has pointed out, it's a sign of something much more profound that is going on, and the culture is basically just dying. I think the problem is that we have to dialectically go back. Ralph has some radical ideas that I love. We have to radically go back to 1945 and said, what was the cost of us going into this sort of peace mode in 1940, pretending borders could never be moved and everything is going to be peaceful forever, and we're going to create the European Union, and the Germans and the French will be peaceful forever. Because it's just pulled all the libido out of European culture completely. And we're now catching up with the 2020s. And demographics is going to be a bigger issue than climate in the 2030s. We're going to be absolutely exposed to the fact that we don't breed any longer. Women don't give birth to children. The family life is going to come back. That's why I think national conservatism will rise first. Liberal nationalism comes afterward. National conservatism is where Europe is heading. Whereas liberal nationalism was being practiced in Singapore, Dubai, and the different trading posts of the world. And those are the points you're going to look at because they're going to be more prosperous than anywhere else in the world. The most prosperous places in the world are going to be these liberal national places, which are going to be city-states to begin with. But national conservatism is going to be huge in Europe for the simple reason that demographics is the biggest issue confronting Europe. And that is economic decline, lack of entrepreneurship, lack of new technologies. We're basically becoming serfs to Americans and even the Chinese. And that I think is the problem in Europe. Where's the European Elon Musk? I haven't seen him.
Great comment. I think really, I mean, the lack of dynamism and sort of belief in future is huge here. I mean, for whatever you can say about the American political climate, they're still launching stuff into space via private entrepreneurship. I mean, one can be as pessimistic as one wants about the US, and I'm 50-50. It depends on where I wake up. When I wake up that day. But the thing is, I think in Europe, right, is why would you want to reclaim a European identity? Because I mean, it's nice under the security blanket. The problem is not a lot of stuff gets done, and as we've said, I mean, a fundamental fact of European civilization has been, the fact that you can compete in the between European states. You have this in American states, ironically, more than the European states. It feels like. I mean, in Europe, all things the thing we've done is it's poor people. I mean, because of the German dominance of economy, you're driving. The sort of Italians and Latins are doing chefs and servants jobs in the north, and we have some car manufacturers in Germany who are going to run out of resources because they come from Russia. It's pretty grim, I have to say. And I think Alexander's point of economics might not appeal to many of our philosophy fans, ironically. But I mean, it should be really taken seriously because this is what's driving this. Why aren't we the place to be? I mean, Sweden always sort of dreamt of itself as the liberal Sweden, always dreamt of itself as the standard bearer of Europeans tech companies, Spotify, blah blah blah, whatever. But I mean, but the sort of course we're heading, everyone's fleeing. Why would you like to be here? And this is a serious question. It can't only be a question of identity, and however important that is. But it has to be a sort of reawakening, a radical rethinking of the way we do business. I mean, on all levels.
Let me be a liberal nationalist here. So the irony is this. The Russians and the Arabs are leaving London. Good. They never did anything anyway except chopped oil money, whatever they had. They never contributed to the British economy in general. They were hated everywhere. That's why everybody hates London. That's when Brexit happened. The Russians' tariffs are out. Being replaced by what? Indians and Nigerians. What do you think Indians and Nigerians are doing in Britain? Their kids are like top of every fucking school in Britain right now. The Indian Nigerians kids are top score, way ahead of British kids, like the top. So the irony is this, just to throw liberal nationalism in there, the irony is that the Labour, which is totally Tony Blair, it's even open now that Keir Starmer's been seeing Tony Blair for years. Tony Blair is back. Labour move to the right, go liberal nationalist, and take over the UK. And here's the irony. Labour will run the UK when the UK has to declare Brexit to be a success. For me, that's the hope of Europe, because I just see these people from all over the world coming here. Because when I go to Italy and I meet Italians who still don't speak English, I'm just like, listen, English is the imperial language. If you don't speak it, you're not even in the game. And Italy doesn't have any tech startups. It doesn't, none of those things. It's just a tourist card running into like a really conservative retirement home economy, protesting everything. You can't build anything in Italy. You can't build anything. Nothing's being built. Not a single construction site. Nowhere in Italy. It's nothing now but a tourist economy for old people. That's all there's left to it. Vineyards and nothing else. So the question is this, if Brexit works, we can throw it into the mix. If Brexit actually works, and the Labour government actually will have to take credit for making it work, which is the total irony. Then the question is Britain then the only hope? Was somebody who actually got this new fucking damn energy into the place and threw the liberty into it? And, all the startups in Europe right now, they're all British.
I mean, I would add, because I think Carl touched on something that probably we have to talk in greater detail at some point as we move forward with this podcast. With this, we have a problem in the educational system. What was the famous saying by what was it, Wellington, when asked how they defeated Napoleon, and they said Napoleon was defeated on the playing fields of Eton. I mean, maybe it's apocryphal, I don't know, but I think this is really a thing. And we have done some horrible things to young people all across, not just the West, the world, particularly with COVID. And of course, also with the ideologization and the indoctrination of what's happening in schools. And I'm not just talking about the woke stuff and that. I think that's a modern phenomenon. But we kind of have lost a little bit the way of what the purpose of education is. I think we allow, if you allow me to say this, I think we way too often allow children to become fat, right? I mean, we have completely detached physical fitness or being in tune with your body, both physically and mentally. I think there's a lot of kind of the concept of a holistic education that the Greeks understood, that the Romans understood, that I think we still understood in the 19th century. We have completely given up. And I mean, ultimately, you mentioned demographics, Alexander, right? And I think this is true. But I think creating a mindset of people wanting to have children, wanting to have a family, that starts early. I think this is a vision of your life that you have to not, by force, but that you have to carefully, gradually foster within a young generation that they then want it themselves. We'll see in the years to come in Hungary and other areas of the world whether generous family support programs will make a massive difference. I have my doubts. I think they will have an effect, but if they're really going to push, let's say, birth rates from currently 1.8, 1.9 live birth per woman, if they push it to 2.1 or even more, that is to be seen. I'm skeptical about it because you need to want to have children, right? Then it's nice to get help as well. But the first step is I actually want children. And I think the number of people that want it is not as big as it should be. And then the second thing is a little bit off topic, but I think that is also important because that part of the equation we barely talk about is there are many people who want children but can't for, infertility and similar issues. So this is, I think, a part of the story that is not mentioned that often. In my own, it's anecdotal, of course, but even in my own surroundings, many of friends of mine needed to resort to IVF because they couldn't conceive in the natural way. Like they wanted to have a family, they wanted to have children. So this was not we want to live our life, hedonism, no children. No, they wanted, but they couldn't. And then you have the economic problem because IVF is expensive. They were lucky enough to have the financial means to have a family. But that, of course, is potentially a door that is closed to others as well. So what's going on in the schools, what's going on in education, both intellectually but also physically, I think is a topic that nobody in the West is paying enough attention to. And I hope that we, as the men who want to save the West, will do that. We will not repeat the same mistake.
Most of you now have addressed the issue of demographic changes, and I would say that's another reason, incidentally, why I would not stress too much, at least not in this context, the distinction that we referred to earlier between the imperial and the national, because I think Europe is turning into the small writ imperial model as well because of demographic changes. And so this is why I think nationalism in the more traditional sense is already dead. And for nationalism to continue in some form, it must take on certain imperial characteristics, even if it's not literally imperial, which is why I think that America and Europe suffer from similar problems in that regard, regardless of the lack of more traditional nationalism or nationalistic origins here in the United States.
That's interesting, Benedict. I want to stay with that. I firmly believe that demography is going to be way bigger than climate 10 years from now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
in European discourse. Okay, makes perfect sense, right? You can't have a society where nobody gives birth to children. Once you realize that's what you created the monster. So fundamentally, to me, when I talk to young women today, I say feminism should have gone for biofeminism 30 years ago, but it didn't because it didn't know what it was doing. If biofeminism had existed, the women would be sponsored to give birth to children between 18 and 28 and get a higher education between 28 and 35 and then have a career between 35 and 70. All young women I talk to when I say that love the idea. They love that idea. Do you see how radical that idea is, though? And how you totally have to ideologically re-educate entire society to go for something as radical as biofeminism. Just basically saying that we have actually created a society which is all about the male life cycle. Because all these women Rolf talks about, I see them in psychoanalysis. They're 35 years old, they finally want to have the baby, they go to the clinic, and somebody tells them, you can't have babies, it's too late. Should have started when you were 18. Because that's actually how the female body operates. Once we start going towards that female body understanding, and understanding how fundamental it is for a society to even exist. When that happens, if we haven't addressed this issue with national conservatism, which I think is going to have a great time the next 10 years, women are independent or whatever, then address that, we're going to go straight for fascism and force women to give birth to babies sooner or later. I think that's where this is going to end up 50 years from now, unless we address the question. So I'm saying, as a liberal nationalist, I have to back off. I cannot, as a liberal nationalist, convince any woman in the world to give birth to children because it's against my liberalism. But I totally subscribe that if national conservatives want to go hard on this issue and say that without functioning demographics, we're done, then I totally support it for the next 10 years.
So one point here, and Alexandra, I do appreciate as a how you phrase it, extreme right Marxist, that you see the necessity of one ideology to then be superseded by another one. That's just pure ideology or pure Marxism. I really appreciate that. But I wanted to corroborate one of your points that you made here with regards to demography and pronatalists, that these statistics don't really exist at European level, but the US do have statistics on the number of women. Something akin to every second woman in the US would not be able to have a child post the age of 30. They're like, statistically speaking, they will not have those children. This is badly matched by the fact that 95% of those women think that they will be a mother. So if we come back to the question of education, surely if we talk about we need to educate about a number of issues, climate being one, well, demographics would also be one that vastly differs in terms of the people's preferences. And as you point out, how you even create the basis for society or civilization. But I want to see, Benedict, if you could speak to this point, because you also raised in your scholarly work the importance of religion with regards to safeguarding high numbers of nativity, and how you see basically, I mean, the unlikelihood, if I'm going to show my cards here, of religion in that traditional sense coming back, unless it's as some sort of live action role playing game that people turn to paganism just for the hell of it, essentially.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's going to come back that strongly, and it's in an earlier form. I mean, what one does see going on right now, of course, is people embracing a sort of embracing the importance of that tradition without actually believing in it. There has been, at least, I mean, there's some reaction in that regard, at least, going on. But when it comes to the religion itself, I mean, I'm a bit more, as in many contexts, I'm slightly more optimistic when it comes to the United States than Western Europe, because I think it's simply that process of secularization has gone so much farther there than here, although, I mean, obviously the same thing is happening here. But religion, I think another issue to be also addressed in this context is that religion always makes a comeback in some form or other whenever there's hardship. And the way things are going right now, we are going to have more hardship, and that in turn, of course, could lead to a certain return to that. I mean, why is the left dead in Israel, and why is religion continuing to remain strong in Israel? Well, it's because it's not the only reason, but it's because they're, in part, because they're consistently exposed to hardship. And with the weakening of the United States, we're probably going to get ourselves into a conflict sooner or later, which is going to be more difficult than previous conflicts that we've had, at least in recent living memory. And that is the sort of thing that can lead to a resurgence of religion, and then in turn to a resurgence of birth rates. I consider such a scenario to be less likely, at least in the short term, in Western Europe than here, but that remains to be seen.
I would just like to add on to Alexander's points that I think, this is a crucial issue that has to be solved, because I think it's one of the hidden factors behind the sort of male, female, right-left divide. We've simply built a system that's, you could sort of, male conservatives can say, well, we're conservative, but people have figured out in the last 5 years that, major corporations are hugely anti-conservative and highly anti-women, and it's not. It's not by choice. It's just by expediency, I'd say. And the thing is, like, if you need to build a sort of nation state and you build a community and build a national project, this needs to be front and center, because A, if there are no children, there is no future of the nation, and B, how are you supposed to run politics if half of the population are, Greta Thunberg sort of apocalyptic girl saints walking around, enjoying telling people about the end of the world? That's not going to have, pro-natalist sort of sentiment spread around the country, to say the least. And I think if you talk to people who aren't willing to have children, I think climate propaganda it's probably the most contributing factor. I see this actually as a very central point here. This is a thing that has to be solved for a functioning politics, but also for the survival of the civilization.
We have three different alternatives here that already exist. One of them is just to let go and let civilization go down, and that's essentially where South Korea and Italy are stuck at the moment. Demographics are now below one child per woman. It's just halving of the population within a generation. They're literally going into extinction. South Korea and Italy are there. Then there's the Swedish-French alternative, which build fucking daycare centers and have a large welfare state and tax the men, and then give the money to women, so women essentially marry the state instead of marrying their husbands. And at least then you go up to some 1.8, 1.7, 1.8 children per woman, which means that you can sort of handle more of an Islamic invasion, but it takes longer for you to actually go extinct. But essentially, you haven't solved the problem, because if you haven't 2.1 children per woman, you don't have a reproduction rate. Then the third question here, and that's why I want Raul's point in, is this attempt in Central Europe to go sort of Catholic, essentially Catholic, hardcore conservative, and say, well, we're going to pay women to have children, and we're going to see if we can use the wallet to make them more children, because the welfare state alone is not safe enough for women to feel that they want to have children. And maybe then also the great thing with Hungary and Poland, I think it's part of alternative, is that if women have children earlier in their lives, they'll have more children. If they start at 35, we know they only have one kid and a dog. If they start at 18, usually have 3 kids. So I'm sure the Hungarians and the Poles are aware of these things. So I want to hear Raul's how are they actually thinking demographics when it comes to Central Europe?
Well, I think that they realize the problem more than others, right? Just as probably some of if you look at the Hungarian tax code, this is really something that's very generous. If a woman gets 3 children, she's never going to pay a single cent of income tax again in her entire life. So the government is very generous in support for housing, right, for married couples. So they really, really do a lot. And you can see a slight uptick in particularly marriage rates. But they are, when it comes to birth rates, they are still below replacement. And it goes back to what you guys, I think, already have pointed to, is it's not just an economic problem. The economic part is a story, is part of the story, but there's more to it. As you said, Alexander, right? Even if you have all these programs in place, if women only realize they might say, oh, this is great, I'm going to use all of this when I'm 35 and have my first child, right? Then probably these things start to have an effect way too late. What you said, I think, is actually much clever, to say, make a system where you can tell a young woman, have a child in your early 20s, but don't worry, there will be plenty of time and support for your career afterwards. I think that might be a much, much better approach. So a little bit is an attempt to split the baby, to say you still have late family formation, you just then support financially that late family formation. But the problem is the late part that prevents the family formation, not so much the economic part. And the other thing is, we have, I think San Francisco is a city where people have more dogs than children. We have become a society, I'm exaggerating slightly for a dramatic effect, some societies, not all of them, that is a little bit hostile to children. At least that's a little bit my impression. I mean, I see this again and again in those in my environment who are, for example, single. Again, anecdotal, I know, but I think it's a little bit of a symptom. So many women have dogs these days, particularly young women. And I wonder what the reason for that is. I guess one of it is that they like dogs. Okay, but I think there is an element of a child replacement there. Not everywhere, not all the time, but I think that's part of the story. I think the maternal instinct does exist. I mean, horrible that 5 men are here talking about maternal instincts and female biology, right? This is going to bring us into trouble. But I think this is still there. But it seems that in polite society, if you say, I bring my dog, people say, sure, bring your dog. If you say, can I bring my kid? It's like, oh, really? I don't know. You want to
But
be
it's
friends?
as you say, this is why they call themselves dog mom.
Yes.
Because as you say, that maternal instinct is there. And whenever you see somebody call herself a dog mom, you see what she really wanted was a child, but it's the dog. So,
and I also believe that half a year ago, I think the Pope spoke on this. I mean, say what you will about the ill progressivities of the Catholic Church, but they are keeping up with the times. And they basically came out and said, having a dog is not a replacement for a child. And there is intrinsic value in the newborn life of a child, as this has to be said. I mean, it is. I think it's hilarious in a sense. We in Sweden we're now debating should 12-year-olds be able to change their gender, but bringing kids to dinner parties, that's reactionary. This is the place.
The other side of that, Carl. The other side of that is that South Korea has now banned dog meat, and by the way, it's delicious. It's delicious to eat a dog steak. They bred a type of dog for steak in Korea, and that was great. That's banned because all the girls on Instagram have dogs instead of kids. So the dog in China, Korea, Japan has replaced the kid. This is now a universal phenomenon. And of course, oikophobia is just something that is allowed in the culture already taking itself so much it's not even reproducing. What I'm doing personally, because I think it's a spiritual journey, so I'm doing men's work. I work with men. I work with women. I work with women. I work with men. I put men into isolation and do men's events, and they're sold out. But it's a long, long journey. We only just got started 10 years ago. It's going to take generations. But essentially, in the men's movement today, being a father is seen as the absolute ideal. And here's the shocking thing. The young men who come to us at 23, they also think they can postpone all these decisions to later in life and may become dads when they're 45, if at all. And then we just have to tell them, listen, when you're 45, you're a granddad. You have children when you're 23, biologically, and the woman is 20. This distortion of biological fact, to me, is even worse than the oikophobia, but they're both signs of a decay of culture. A culture that has lost all connection to its own biology has certainly lost all connection. If you lose connection to your nature, you cannot have a connection to your culture, because culture is always built on nature. That's how decadent this is.
So we are soon coming to a close, but in order for this not to be summarized that the men who saved the West turns out to be women who saved the West, I wanted to broach you on this topic of basically what is then to be saved. This could also be the topic for a future conversation, but I don't want to leave our listeners disappointed. So your 5 cents, gentlemen, if you wish. Ralph, in a way, you started this out with saying education. I, for one, would be interested in having you develop that a bit further.
I think I have two answers to this. One is one of the reasons why I think the West deserves to be saved is if you look at the world, everybody wants to move to the West. So something must be about it. Everybody wants to get to let's say, the Imperial center, if you want, whether it's Europe or the United States, or Australia or Canada. Everybody wants to get there. So I think there is something about there. But this is the problem. I believe, and this brings us back to the liberal element of national liberalism, that to a certain extent, you can absorb immigration. You can fulfill the people's wish to live a Western life But what you have to do is you have to explain to those people, re-education and otherwise, and we can talk about this in a future podcast, to say, the reason why I want to come here is because here are the things that we do better. And I think then this brings us to the confidence issue, to say, listen, there is a reason why this is, to quote Donald Trump, if you allow me, we can cut this out later, why this is not a shithole country. And the reason why the place you come from is potentially, is not because you suffered from colonialism and the bad Europeans. It's because, unfortunately, not to your fault of you as an individual, you guys didn't get it. And this is something that has to be said. We know this, by the way. Why am I saying this? Because the countries where we never talk about the imperial legacy are countries in Southeast Asia, because they get it, right? And there's also a reason why we don't have a lot of migration from Japan to Europe, or from China to Europe, for that matter, right? They come for the education, right? They come also increasingly for the liberties, but that's a political issue. Take South Korea. There's not a lot of exodus from South Korea. I mean, as Alexander pointed out, they will run out of South Korea, and so there will not be many people that can leave South Korea. But it's because they got these things together, and I think the same is true for the West. But the West has been, just the last point on this, the Asian countries have a tendency to be in their own way nationalist, but they lack a little bit, or they miss a little bit the liberal part. I think it's easier for a South Korean to become a European than it will ever be for a European to become a South Korean. And it's even easier for a South Korean to become an American, but much harder for an American to become a South Korean. Not saying it's impossible, but there are some cultures that are easier to integrate to and some cultures that are harder to integrate to. And actually, historically, the West was a culture that was fairly easy to integrate into. But I think we have lost this because we started to believe what makes integration easy is not to demand anything. But I think it's exactly backwards. What makes integration easy is that you demand something, but don't make it impossible. And I think this is kind of what we have to identify, is that increasingly, what is it that you have to integrate people into? What is it that young men, particularly as Alexander's mentioned, have to be taught in school for them to become productive members of society? Which values really in detail, in definition, is important to instill in the next generation? This is a very worthwhile conversation. Whether we will be successful, I don't know. But I always say I'd rather fight the good fight than lose than not fight the good fight at all.
I just want to add one thing, because I love this conversation. I'll have another one. The elephant in the room is this one. There are two peoples in the West who breed like crazy and have tons of children. And they're called Israelis and Palestinians. And we haven't even talked about the elephant in the room, which I think is that discussion. And another one I want to throw in there, just to make us a little more uncomfortable about the Islam thing, because I agree with Benedict's criticism here. But I actually think the place on the map right now, which is best place to thrive over the next 10 years and surprise everybody, is Turkey. Now is Turkey's time, historically, because Turkey has actually absorbed millions of people, and it seems to work. And it's kind of shocking, and Erdogan is finally learning his lesson. So let's see where that goes. I just want to throw those two things into the ring, but we have tons of more stuff to discuss if we are the men who saved the West. Benedict, over to you.
Yeah, indeed, we do. Yeah, I would add also that the point about that we have to make demands. I mean, that's something we only make demands of newcomers if we really believe in ourselves. This is why typically assimilation in the United States was better than in Europe, because we didn't have the welfare state and because we actually believed in ourselves. If you came as a foreigner, you had to work. You had to take upon yourself a series of duties right away, which aided assimilation. Whereas the welfare state, of course, in West European countries hindered assimilation, because one could come and stay, and one did not have to go to an office where one met Swedish people if one was a foreigner in Sweden, but rather one could just stay at home and in one's own little clique, in one's own little microcosm of one's home culture. Now, of course, assimilation is becoming more and more difficult in the United States, in tandem with the fact that our welfare state is growing and growing, and which is why precisely, and that goes hand in hand with oikophobia, of course, because when we don't make those demands of foreigners, we don't make those demands because we don't believe that we have the right to make those demands. Then, of course, we actually do the foreigners a disfavor in the sense that we hinder their assimilation. When it comes to Israel and that whole area, I'm not sure if that's something we'll leave for next time, or now you're a little tantalizing there, Alexander, but it would have been. But yeah, maybe we're out of time. I'm not sure.
Benedict Beckeld, Ralph Schöllhammer, Alexander Bard, thank you so much for coming on to the Manifesto podcast.
Yeah.
Thank
to
you.
be continued, guys. To be continued. Thank you for this.